Hi everyone, my name is Ryan Ripepi, and I'm excited to share my research presentation with you today. Most of you probably read my introduction in one of my blog posts, but I thought I'd reintroduce myself here too. My name is Ryan, I'm 23. I recently moved to Alexandria, Virginia, and I started a position as a program assistant for a section in the Marine Corps. I graduated in the spring of 25 from St. John's in New York City with my Bachelor's of Science in Adolescent English Education. So I'm just slowly gaining more experience and filling my toolkit day by day. So from my experience thus far, I've recognized that a lot of high school English classrooms still rely heavily on essays and written assignments. And while those are still very important today, students truly do communicate in so many different ways. And so my research explored whether student-created podcasts could strengthen literacy while also still increasing engagement and motivation and helping students develop communication skills that are still relevant both inside and outside of the classroom. So before getting into the research, I first want to talk a little bit about why this topic even matters. So students spend today and a lot of their time consuming digital media through platforms like Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. That's no secret. So whether we like it or not, that's how many of them communicate and learn outside of the classroom as well. So instead of seeing those platforms as competition, I think English classrooms could build on those same communication skills. And podcasting is one way to give students an opportunity to combine those traditional literacy skills like reading and writing with a more modern form of communication. So rather than being, the audience, students get to become creators and share their own ideas with others. So the first major theme that kept appearing throughout my research was that student engagement and motivation was being increased. So across multiple studies, students weren't just completing the assignment, but they were actually becoming more invested in it. And I think a big reason for that is purpose. Instead of creating something that only the teacher is going to see and read, students know that their classmates or even a broader audience are going to hear and listen to what they have to say through a podcast. And that really does change the approach and the entire assignment completely. It's kind of like giving a toast at a wedding. You're probably not just going to wing it because there's actually going to be people listening. You want your words to mean something. And in my eyes, podcasting creates that same sense of accountability and purpose for students. They really do tend to spend more time reading and researching and thinking critically because they want to create something that they're proud to share. For example, Che 2023 found that creating podcasts actually encouraged students to become more active participants in their learning, with many saying that they read course materials more carefully and did additional research to prepare themselves. And one student actually admitted that I wouldn't have done the podcast if it wasn't for the reading, or I wouldn't have done the readings if it wasn't for the podcast. And I personally thought that was a pretty powerful statement because it just shows how simply changing the format of an assignment can completely change a student's level of investment. Rather than becoming passive learners, students are becoming more active participants and have a reason to engage, with the course content. Another finding that really stood out to me was that podcasting isn't really, a technology assignment, but it's a literacy assignment that happens to use technology. So before students ever even press the record button, they still have to do everything we expect in a normal English classroom. So reading closely, researching their topic, organize their ideas, writing a script, peer review, so on and so forth. And actually, recording the podcast is really just the final step of that entire process. What I found pretty interesting was that several studies actually reported improvements in students' oral communication and their confidence. Because students had opportunities to practice and listen back to their own recordings, many actually became more comfortable in their ideas and experienced less anxiety when it came to public speaking. And to me, that's really what podcasting is so valuable. Again, it doesn't replace those traditional literacy instruction assignments or expectations, but it just gives students another meaningful way to demonstrate what they've learned while continuing to strengthen those basic skills. So a third theme that I found throughout the research was that the development of digital literacy and communication skills. So as Philip and Garcia explained, today's students shouldn't just be consumers of digital content, but they should have opportunities to become creators in their safe space. So podcasting really does give students that opportunity by combining, communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking skills. As Besser and her colleagues also demonstrated, English teachers really can use podcasts in a variety of ways, from literacy analysis to character interviews to book discussions. You can even figure out how to loop in like Socratic seminars. So there's truly so many different options out there. And then overall, I just found that the research suggests that podcasting helps students actually develop their communication skills that are needed in the future, going beyond the classroom, whether, that be in the service, college, their future careers, and everyday life. What they learn in the classroom is really going to help them prepare for the future. We all know that. So the final theme I found was authentic audiences really do give learning a greater sense of purpose. So instead of creating something, that only the teacher's going to hear or that their classmates are going to read, students that are creating something that can be shared with others, even the broader community, give students who are creating them so much more purpose at the end of the day. Guggenheim and colleagues demonstrated this by having students actually showcase their created podcast through a public QR code exhibition. And it really gave the classroom a real audience behind, their 18, 19 person setting. So knowing that others were going to hear their work actually encouraged them to take greater ownership of what they created. Like Sharon Noble also discussed how today's students learn best when they're actively creating and sharing knowledge rather than consuming it. And to me, that is really one of the biggest takeaways of creating podcasts. It gives students a chance to recognize that their voices matter and what they can create, inform, and connect with really does have a purpose. And just some final takeaways for you all. I think one of the biggest takeaways from my research is that podcasting can offer students just another meaningful way to demonstrate what they've learned. It combines the traditional literacy skills with the authentic communication, encourages student engagement and motivation, and just gives students an opportunity to share their voices in a way that feels more relevant and purposeful. I also mentioned here that at the same time, I don't think podcasts should replace those traditional assignments like essays or DBQs, though we're still, state requirements and an integral part of an English classroom. But instead, I see podcasting more as an instructional tool that teachers can use to, expand the ways students learn, communicate, and demonstrate their understanding. And lastly, as technology continues to shape the way we communicate each and every day, I think it's important that our classrooms evolve alongside that. I know some schools are different, doesn't have a lot of resources tangible, but I still think that keeping that strong literacy center at the core is going to make all the difference. These are just some of the references I used along the way. And that concludes my presentation. So thank you all very much for taking the time to listen and learn more about my research. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out using the email on the screen. Thank you.